Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I think we've given everyone enough time to be able to join us. Thank you all for joining us. Those of you who are watching us online, thank you for those of you who came out today to join us in person for this important program to mark the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others who died in the Holocaust as victims of the Nazis and their collaborators. We pledge that we will never forget them as we educate and tell their stories to honor them by defending everyone's right to live with dignity in a just and peaceful world. Out of these horrors, the United Nations was created to bring countries together for peace and our common humanity, to prevent any repetition of such crimes against humanity. The resurgence of hatred in recent years, from violent extremism to attacks on places of worship, show that anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice and religious bigotry, racism, is very much still with us. But just as hatred persists, so must our resolve to fight it today and every day as we commemorate the victims of the Holocaust by pursuing truth, remembrance, and education, and by building a peace and justful community here and all around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I hand it over now to our CEO. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm Stephen Pointer. I run education here at the Holocaust Center. Thank you all for joining us. Our CEO, Tally Dibble.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon for this important commemoration. We have an incredible group here. We're just going to take a moment to acknowledge who is with us. So first of all, welcome to our Holocaust survivors and their families. Can you please show by hand? I don't want to make you stand up, but please raise your hand if you're a Holocaust survivor or a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. And we want to acknowledge our liberators and descendants of liberators. If you are a liberator, descendant of liberator, can you please raise your hand? Thank you, and a huge welcome to our audience that's joining us at home and to our community members that came out to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Also a special welcome to Commissioner Wilson, who's here joining us this afternoon. And we have Juan Lopez, who's representing Congressman Darren Soto here as well. So thank you for being here to represent. Our commemoration today is dedicated to Tess Weiss. She's the founder of the center and of blessed memory. This is the first annual commemoration that she is not able to be part of. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are extremely grateful for all the remarkable work that she's done in this community. Today is dedicated to remembering, but we know that remembering is not enough. It must be followed by action. We recommit ourselves every day to educating students of all ages that these atrocities are never forgotten, and explain why we must always speak out against anti-Semitism and hatred in all its forms. Exactly a decade ago, 24 educators from across the US came together for a 3-week journey that would change their lives. I was among them, very fortunate, and I was on this journey with Matthew Rozell, who you're going to hear from today. You are in for a huge treat. This journey was called the Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teacher Program, and it was founded by a Holocaust survivor named Vlad Kamid. On the surface, many of us there did not have that much in common. In fact, I admit I was very surprised that the majority of educators in the 90% were not Jewish. I remember thinking, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Why are they so passionate about teaching these lessons? We came from different backgrounds, different religions, different geographies, but something brought us all together, and it ended up being a very life-altering experience. We quickly bonded in a way that can only happen when you have Holocaust educators spend the night on a train crossing border from one country to another, and you can get the picture full with German shepherds and emotional educators. It was really an experience that led us over 3 weeks. We encountered over 9 concentration camps. We visited ghettos. We visited sites of atrocities. It was really a bonding trip. I learned so much from each educator on the trip, developed lifelong mentors who changed my life and lifelong friendships. And that brings me, that's my personal connection to Matthew, but I want to tell you how the rest of the world knows him. And then we're going to hear from him in a little bit. Matthew Rozell is an award-winning history teacher, author, blogger, and speaker. He's been featured as the ABC World News Person of the Week and has had his work filmed for CBS News, NBC Learn, and Israeli Broadcast Authority, the New York State Teachers Union, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He was the recipient of the New York State Education Department's Yavner Teacher Award for distinguished contribution to teaching the Holocaust and human rights. He also led archaeological excavations at formative military sites relative to the birth of our nation for many years, which you will see in an upcoming book. He's a remarkable author, and I've had the joy and pleasure of learning from him. He also has a remarkable film, you're going to hear all about this, A Train Near Magdeburg, that is in the works right now, so very exciting. I just want to take a moment to thank the many people that made this event possible, starting with United Arts, Arts and Cultural Affairs, Culture Builds Florida and Shalom Orlando, Jewish Academy of Orlando, Israel American Council, Congregation Ohev Shalom, Temple Israel, Congregation of Reformed Judaism, Central Florida Hillel, Interfaith Council of Central Florida, and Jewish Family Services. And a huge thank you to my team and board for making this possible. And just to reiterate, all of those incredible names is just a reminder of how many amazing organizations we have here in Central Florida doing this important work. And we are very grateful for their partnership. So we ask you to silence your cell phones if you haven't already, and to enjoy and participate in this upcoming commemoration. Thank you. And I'm going to welcome Cantor Bryce. And Rabbi Kay.
Nine, 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 nine. 999. I am hurting, I am struggling. From where will my help come? I need something to keep me going. From where will my help come? Your voice ring. Your voice ring. Ezri meim Adonai, aseh shamayim va'aretz. Ezri meim Adonai, aseh shamayim va'aretz. I lift up to the mountains, from where will my help come? I lift up my eyes to the mountains, from where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, creator of heaven and earth. My help comes from the Lord, creator of heaven and earth. Oh, Esainaim, Erim, Me'ain, Yavo Esri. Esainaim, Erim, Me'ain, Yavo Esri. Esainaim, Erim, Me'ain, Yavo Esri. Esainaim, Erim. From where will my help come?
So we're going to take a moment right now to do our candle lighting and have a reading that will be led by our education specialist here, Leah Harnick, and assisting with some of our survivors who will come up to light our candles with Ms. Brooke Chevnik. So we'll start that now.
So we're going to begin our candle lighting ceremony, and I'm going to invite some of our survivors and second gens in the audience to come up and light a candle. So first, I'm going to ask Suzanne if you want to come up. We light our candles by passing the light of memory and hope from one to one another. Let us honor those whose lights were put out, whose dreams, hopes, and lives were snuffed out before they even lived. For the 1.5 million children, we light this candle. And now I'm going to invite Harry, and if your family would like to join you, they can. We light a candle for the untold millions for whom there is no one to mourn, whose entire families were annihilated, and who lie in unmarked graves. Mitch and Helen, if you guys would like to come up. We light a candle for those who stood upright while others were bending to immoral will, for the righteous among the nations who risked and even gave their lives to help their fellow human beings. We light this candle. Greg and Candy, if you guys would like to come up and light a candle. We light a candle for those brave soldiers who liberated the camps, who carried the dead and near dead in their arms to a kinder and more humane future, and for those who served with the Allied forces to put an end to tyranny and oppression. We light this candle. Gail, I'm going to invite you to light this candle. We light a candle for the nearly 6 million Jews and for the 6 million non-Jews who perished in a plain system of human destruction, the scale of which had never been imagined before. And Mr. Frank Towers, we're now going to invite you to light our last candle. We light this candle for those who live, even now under the yoke of oppression, in places where the threat of genocide is real and ever present. We light these candles. And that concludes our lighting.
Thank you all. So we'd like to welcome now our speaker for the session that you're all here for. Please welcome Mr. Matthew Rozell.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for the warm welcome. As Tally stated, she and I got to know each other in 2013 in the summertime when we took a journey of a lifetime with the Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teachers Program. We toured 9 concentration camps, several of them death camps, and there is a difference. Which I'm not sure I was totally aware of at the time, but it was an incredible experience. And it was, as Tally stated, life-altering for many of us on the journey. The reason I was selected for this trip, and thank goodness I was, because as stated, it was a very profound journey that answered a lot of questions for me. It also raised a lot of questions, as Tally, I'm sure, can relate. But part of the trip, I mean, most of it was paid for by that foundation, but probably about, I'm not sure what the percentage was. There was like $3,000 or $4,000 that, of course, we teachers had to come up with to go on this journey. And I was lucky enough to have some of my American soldier friends who pitched in, led by Frank Towers Sr. Frank Towers Jr. is in the audience. He happens to be very local here. But his dad changed my life. And his dad was the president of the 30th Infantry Division Soldiers of World War II, who helped me organize reunions with American soldier liberators and the actual Holocaust survivors that they saved from a train that was destined to be annihilated in the closing days of World War II. So our presentation today is the story of these liberators and what these American soldiers did, but also what I learned about the Holocaust. I come from a small town in upstate New York. It's called Hudson Falls. It's right on the Hudson River, about 3.5 hours north of New York City. And I went to a high school where I don't remember another Jewish student. My town is a very small town. It probably was about 6,000 people. My graduating class was just over 200. And when I left the town to go off to college in New York State, a SUNY state school, I had no intention of becoming an educator. I taught history for 30 years at my alma mater in Hudson Falls, New York. And my dad was a high school history teacher across the river in Glens Falls. And you know what I remember about Dad coming home from school? He never came home from school in a bad mood. In fact, a lot of times he was singing. And we know that teaching, well, a lot of occupations are very stressful, but he was never in a bad mood. And I think that made an impression on me. Although when he asked me when I was a senior in high school, what did I want to do? My answer was, I want to get out of this town and not come back. And I don't want to be a teacher like you. You know, I had to twist the knife a little bit before I went off to school. Well, I went off to school. I got into a pre-law program, but I really liked history. And again, my dad taught Western Civ, so he was always previewing like Renaissance. The Renaissance in Greece and Rome was his big thing. So he taught world history. And I took a liking to it. So I took a lot of history classes when I was at college, and I didn't take a pre-law class until I was a senior, and I decided that really isn't for me. So what am I going to do with my life? I've just burnt through 4 years of college. I took a lot of history classes, but I never specialized in anything. So I guess where I'm going with this, I went back after into a teaching program. Of course, I met my wife, Laura, who's in the audience right here. She's also a former educator. We both retired a couple of years ago. But I wound up teaching at my old high school in Hudson Falls, New York, because they were desperate in mid-year. They needed a teacher. They went through 3 other teachers before me. And next thing you know, I'll be underneath mom and dad's roof, living in the garage, driving the old man's secondhand car up to the high school that I tried to escape. And I stayed there for 30 years. And the first couple of years was kind of touch and go. I wasn't sure I wanted to be an educator. The kids were kind of rough on me, you know, young teacher. They already ate up, like I said, 2 teachers that year. And but by the end of a couple of years, I kind of got the feel for it. I actually became the class advisor for the class from HE double hockey sticks. And I really started to fall into a rhythm, and I began to enjoy the students. And I was teaching the same exact subject as my father. And he was still teaching at the time, but we never saw each other teach. We were in different schools, but he would try to hand materials down to me. But I kind of got the feel for what I wanted to do, and I knew my stuff. But one thing I didn't know a lot about was the Holocaust, because I don't remember learning a lot in high school. I went to school in the 70s. And by the time I was in that teaching, having to teach it, a world history teacher in New York State, even today, has to teach 8,000 years of history in 2 years, which amounts to, you know, 180 class periods a year, you know, throwing a couple snow days here and there, a lot of administrative interruptions. You have 2 or 3 42-minute periods to cover all of World War II. And you know, as a young teacher, I didn't know any better. I had to get the kids ready for a state exam, of which there might be a multiple choice or 2 question on it. But I began to spend more time than the allotted 84 minutes or whatever it was, 2 or 3 hours a year on this topic, World War II and the Holocaust. That's a pretty broad topic. But I had an interest in World War II. You know, I graduated from college right around the time of the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II. Actually, it was when the veterans went back to D-Day. President Reagan made an impassioned speech up at Pont du Hoc. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldier veterans there. And I was riveted. I really was riveted to these stories. And a lot of people say to me, because I've written about, I just started my 10th book on World War II oral history. A lot of people will say to me, well, geez, what was your inspiration? My dad was a Korea War vet. I never talked to him about that, really. We didn't discuss it. I read comic books in 8th grade, Sergeant Rock, you know, talk about these graphic novels, getting kids introduced to historical topics today. Man, that's what sparked my interest now that I go back and think about it. But what I began to do when the 10th graders would start to yawn and look out the window in May when the weather was starting to get nice, a day like today, we don't get too many of them up north, but springtime, forget it, their minds are elsewhere. But that's when chronologically you teach the story of World War II and the Holocaust, if you have time, quote unquote. Well, one day I said, how many of you have grandparents or aunts and uncles, or even in some cases your parents who remember what they actually participated in World War II, combat or whatever, a nurse, home front. Every single kid raised two hands because all the grandparents had it, and if they were still with us. So I invented like a 2-page survey, a sheet of paper, 2 sides, and I literally bribed the kids with extra credit. Take this home, get your significant elder to fill it out, bring it back to me, because I want to see where they were, what they did, and how they're going to answer these questions. And one of the questions I had on the sheet was kind of open-ended. It said, why is it important, do you think, for your generation to pass the story of World War II on to future generations, like your grandchildren's generation? And they came back with all kinds of answers, and pretty standard ones were, so it wouldn't be repeated again. But I had one man who filled it out, and he said, in his old man chicken scratch, crooked writing, he said, I don't know how you could make anybody understand what it was like to go through a nightmare like a World War II. And he was absolutely correct. I was born 15 or 16 years after the last shots were fired in World War II. But I took that almost as a challenge, and I invited him and other elders who were willing to come in and tell their stories into the classroom. So this would have been the mid-90s. We had the 50th anniversary. Schindler's List had just come out. Saving Private Ryan was in the works. And people started to get really interested in hearing our veterans tell their stories. Now, what does this have to do with the Holocaust or Holocaust commemoration, which is the reason Tally asked me to come down here today? Well, one of these soldiers told me a story, and the story that he told me was about coming upon a train near the city of Magdeburg in Germany 3 or 4 weeks before the war formally ended. And that's the story I'm going to share with you today, and how I went down this, I don't want to call it a rabbit hole because that sounds almost disrespectful, but a whole new world was opened up to me, and I wound up spending 10 years writing a book on it. And well, here we go. Well, we're here because of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it commemorates the Red Army's liberation of the death camp at Auschwitz, where 1.2 million Jews and many others were murdered, and a place that Tally and I had the honor of visiting in 2013. And she talked about that night train. That night train, what she didn't tell you was it was going from the Czech Republic, crossing the Czech border into Poland. And it was a night train, and you're trying to get some rest on the train, but it's clickety-clack for hours in the dark, going past stations. And it was an experience. But one of the places, we went to Krakow first, and immediately we went down to Auschwitz. Here you see a photograph, famous one from the liberation days in 1945. This is when we were there in the summer of 2013 with one of our friends, fellow teacher who was on the trip. And it was an overcast, cloudy day, and it was pretty intense. It was very intense. And I'm not here really to talk about that trip, but the trip was life-changing and profound. This is a picture taken that afternoon before we set foot, when we were up in those iconic, horrible guard towers, looking into the camp. So when you tell the story of World War II, you obviously have to talk about the Holocaust. And when I was teaching, I used the Time Life series, had a series of books on the different theaters and aspects of the war. And when they talked about the Holocaust, they had this map in there. So I took a photograph of it. And you see these red circles. Of course, those are the quote unquote concentration camps. The one that's circled in green is the one I'm going to talk the most about today. It was called Bergen-Belsen, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But if you look at Poland and you see The huge red dots apparently refers to the amount of people who passed through there or perished there. You can see that your major killing centers were in Poland. And Tally and I went to these places, and I write about it in my 2016 book, A Train Near Magdeburg. This was quite a trip. And, you know, the first camp that was overrun by the Soviets, totally intact, was Majdanek, which you see near the city of Lublin. We went there, and we saw some pretty horrible things. There's still the remains of human beings in ash piles that were preserved by the Soviet Red Army when they liberated it. There's piles of shoes. You'll see. So yeah, this was a pretty intense trip. On the plus side, besides bonding and learning about this history, they put us in 5-star hotels, people, every single night. They took us to concerts, classical piano, because they knew that at the end of the day, we needed to deprogram, number one, not deprogram, that's not the right word, but they wanted us to be taken care of. They wanted us to be nurtured because they knew the history that we were being tasked to go forward with. We were becoming teachers who would go on to teach other teachers. And they wanted to make sure that we were treated right because let's face it, in education, and I'm not, it was a greatest job that me and my wife ever had, so fulfilling and stuff, but it can be tough. You know, you don't get paid a lot. When's the next time I'm going to stay in a 5-star hotel, right? So it was really important. Anyway, to bring you back to my story, this train that I'm going to tell you about today was liberated by the American 30th Infantry Division on April 13th, 1945. It happened to be a Friday the 13th. The day before, actually a couple of days before, the first concentration camps were encountered by the American soldiers. Majdanek was liberated in July 44, back in Poland. The Soviets overran Auschwitz on January 27th, 45. So when you get to April 1945, our GIs have crossed the Rhine River. They're now fighting major battles and they're heading towards the Elbe River. Well, on April 12th, 1945, we see this quote: "We're told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he knows what he's fighting against." I don't know if anybody in here knows who said that. Pretty famous man. Anybody ideas? It was Ike. It was Eisenhower in his first concentration camp tour at Ordruff, which is a subcamp of Buchenwald. General Patton was with him. General Bradley was with him, the top brass. Patton had to go behind a building and throw up, Mr. Tough Guy. And this is them and what they saw. And Ike then ordered, to his everlasting importance, he wanted the American GIs to see these camps with their own eyes. So a lot of our GIs went through Buchenwald. They went through other camps. They saw this because Ike had a vision of the day when somebody was going to say, this never happened, okay? It's all about the eyewitnesses, and that's a big part of the story I'm going to tell you today. On the 13th of April, probably less than 100 miles away, near the banks of the Elbe River, this concentration camp train from Bergen-Belsen was liberated by American GIs. There was one man on board. He was Hungarian Jew. Probably most of the Jews on the train were actually of Hungarian descent at this time. His name was Irvin Abadi. And there's a list, a passenger list that shows up on my website. My website is teachinghistorymatters.com, which you'll see here. But it lists every person who is on the train, as the staff at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial in Germany has tried to recreate the list that the Germans tried to destroy. It's got well over 2,000 names on it. There were 2,500 people on this train. And the very first man who shows up, it shows where their hometown was. It shows where they were liberated, their date of birth. His name was Ervin Abadi, and he was an artist, Hungarian. And he sketched like a madman after the train was liberated. He sketched the day of his liberation. And we'll show you more of his pictures in this slideshow, but here's one of them. And he actually sketches this tank with this soldier, and you see the train in the background with people milling about. Well, this is the photograph that the American GIs took that day. And the narrative is, and I got this from the actual tank commanders who were there, 2 American Jeeps led by a major came to investigate two American tanks led by a major in a Jeep. They needed to investigate this train. The major stopped the Jeep, he had a driver, and he snapped this photo as desperate people swarmed up the hill and the tanks and the American troops arrived. And this was the actual moment that this train was liberated. Okay, so when I interviewed my soldiers, and again, I had a World War II oral history project. This is one story of many. They told me about this picture. So my project started, that's me as a young man in my high school with Pacific Marines, really tough guys. The guy in the middle lost his eyesight on May 14th, 1945 at a place called Okinawa, if you know anything about that. The 2 guys flanking him were at Iwo Jima. And this is the 1990s. We would literally fill the high school library with students. They would come and listen to these soldiers, banter back and forth and tell their stories. So that's kind of how my oral history project began. Then we began to put the stories on the internet when the internet was born. And my very last class was in 2017. And if you look at my billboard, it's headlines from World War II, actual newspapers that one of our veterans gave us. Anyway, my school allowed me to teach a World War II oral history project because I sent these kids out into the community to collect these histories. And I've since been able to put them into books. Okay, my standalone quote unquote book is called The Train Near Magdeburg. When I say standalone, it's not, my series is called The Things Our Fathers Saw, and it starts in the Pacific and it goes on from there. You can look it up if you want, but A Train Near Magdeburg was really something special. Anyway, in 2001, I interviewed this gentleman. He's sitting in a rocking chair. ABC News later got a hold of it and they showed it. We were their Persons of the Week in 2009. And he's rocking away in this chair. For 2 hours, he told me battle stories. Now, this guy's no dummy. He was a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice. His name was Carol S. Walsh. And he was the grandfather of one of my students. And he told me 10 months of battle. He said, Matt, for 10 months, we were in straight combat. He didn't land on D-Day. He came in a month later with the 743rd Tank Battalion, which wound up being attached to the 30th Infantry Division. These names will mean something to you in a minute. But he was in a tank with another guy whose name was George Gross. And he started telling me this story. Actually, his daughter stopped him. When I was about to leave the house after 2 hours of conversation with this guy back and forth, I was about to turn the camera off and his daughter Elizabeth said, Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train? He thought for a minute, he goes, no, I didn't. So he started telling me. It was a beautiful April day. My tank and George Gross's tank, and I got a picture of him, he said. Red Walsh is on the left. Red is, he was Irish. I guess he had red hair at the time. And George Gross is on the right with the pipe. By the end of the war, they each had their own tanks. Now, when they were fighting the Battle of Normandy, going into the Battle of Bulge, they were in the same tank, and they actually didn't get along with each other. George Gross is very by the book. He came from a military family, and Red Walsh was a pre-law student who wanted nothing to do with the Army. He was in the Army because all his friends were in the Army. You're not going to stay home, you know? No, that's not what's going to happen. But he hated it. but he knew he had to be there. He knew there was something that had to be done. Okay, so these guys are fighting pretty horrific battles. And like I said, they fought down through the Battle of the Bulge. They actually crossed over into Germany. And the 30th Infantry Division in October 1944 took the first German city of Aachen, right across the border. But then they had to swing back into Belgium because the Battle of Bulge broke out. And read your history. They were in a tank in sub-zero temperatures where the icicles would form on the inside of the tank. And of course, they're being shelled and shot at the whole time. They lived in a state of constant fear. And when it wasn't high adrenaline, you know, combat fear situation, they were bored. They were frozen. But they, in the spring of 1945, they crossed the Siegfried Line. They crossed the Rhine River on March 25th. And now they're speeding towards Berlin. Well, we know that the agreement made at Yalta was there's not going to be Berlin for the Americans. The Soviet Red Army is going to have the distinction of taking that. And don't forget, the Soviets lost 27 million people in World War II. So they're going to have the honor, but they also lost 300,000 soldiers fighting for the city of Berlin. And this is literally after the train gets liberated. So they're directed further south to a battle at the city of Magdeburg, another ancient city on the Elbe River, German. And they came across this train. And their major said, we got to do something with these people. There were 2,500 people, families on this train. So the major's photograph went into this actual report called an after action report that every unit had to complete every day. And it talks about how the guards ran away and now these people realize they were liberated. So Red Walsh, well, I should call him Judge Walsh now. He said, get a hold of my friend, George Gross, who lives in California, retired San Diego State literature professor, English literature. No, again, no Tommy. He wrote a beautiful narrative of what he remembered. And he said, Gross took a bunch of other pictures that day. And these are the pictures he took because Gross's tank had to stay with this train overnight, whereas Walsh's tank was ordered to go on to the battle. He was only there for an hour. So the two gentlemen graciously agreed to give me their narratives. I interviewed them, Gross by telephone in the classroom in front of high school seniors. And Dr. Gross gave me permission to put these photographs on my website. Okay, so what I didn't know, and my website, World War II Living History Project, Hudson Falls High School, you've heard of it, right? It got about 25 hits a day. But what I didn't know was the German historians at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial in Northwest Germany, where this train had originated from, they found the pictures online and they went, what are these? They'd never seen them before. And, you know, you think about it for a minute. If somebody says Holocaust train, and you know something about the Holocaust, what do you think of? You think about people being herded into cattle cars on their way to a death camp like Auschwitz, right? We've seen some of those photographs, but there aren't too many photographs to show people being taken off a train because they just got freed. Okay, so this is what happened. And the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, they were actually, the historians, one of them, Bern Horstman, he was down in Australia in 2006. I put these photographs on the website in March 2002. 4 years later, I got an email from a grandmother. She's right here, Lexi Keston. And she saw the pictures of the liberation. She said she fell out of her chair. Well, that was because the German historians showed them to her. Now, I had no idea in my classroom in Hudson Falls that any of my work was making any kind of an impact. And I didn't do anything really, except have an interest in these stories and put them on my school website. So we heard from Lexi, and then we heard from 3 other gentlemen, like literally within the next 3 or 4 weeks. So this is the spring of 2006. The guy in the far left his name's Peter Lantos. He was a 6-year-old boy on the train. He was a surgeon at King's College in London, very highly educated. The man in the middle there with the red tie, his name was Dr. Mika Tomkowicz. He was a 6-year-old Polish boy on the train. He is a professor of physics at Brooklyn University in New York City, 3 hours away from me. The other gentleman, there's Red Walsh, the tall, skinny guy next to me. But the other gentleman in the tan jacket was Fred Spiegel, retired airline executive. I believe he was 13. He was a German Jew who later made it to Holland, but then was discovered. Okay, and he was also on this train. So I got a wild idea. I said, look, before Judge Walsh goes back to Florida, I think he was in Port Richey. You know, he hated the cold because of the Battle of Bulge. It was in his body forever. And he said, I got to get out. I can't stand this. I got to get out of here. Well, before he left on September 14th, 2007, we had a mini gathering in our high school in front of 1,000 students. And we introduced each man. Each man told their testimony. And you're actually going to hear from some of these people today. Okay. I actually have audio recording of Judge Walsh and one of the survivors. So it was cool. I had a friend who worked at the Associated Press out of Albany, New York, and he came up and did a story. I said, Chris, are you interested in this? He said, yeah. So he came up and he did a story. And the next day was a Saturday after everybody went home. I had to go buy a new computer. I remember it was pouring. So I went to Staples and I bought a new computer. And of course, the guy's trying to get you to, the upsell is to buy a monitor, right? So he presses the button, the monitor comes on, and the front page of the Yahoo News website was there. And that's my classroom. And it was the lead story on Yahoo News, okay? And Chris's photographer had taken that the day before. And I was like, wow. So later that day, and this again is a Saturday, over the weekend, we heard from 60 more people who had been on that train, okay? The school servers, you know, after about the 20,000 hit, because people were trying to download these pictures, they just shut down. And one of the people I heard from, again, I heard from 60 people who had something to do with the train. That told me there were a lot of children on that train, and there were. And one of the guys I heard from was Frank Towers Sr., Frank Towers Jr.'s dad. And Frank Towers Sr. said, Mr. Rozell, I've been telling the story for a little while here. I was the guy who had to transport these people after the tanks left to get them out of harm's way. And he was the one who took them to an abandoned, not an abandoned, a German military proving ground for artillery called Hillersleben. They were liberating a town, a small town called Farsleben, very tiny agricultural community, you know, maybe about 15, 20 minutes drive outside of Magdeburg. But he said it took half a day to get them 10 miles to this German base where there were still German doctors and nurses on site. There were barracks and there were hospitals. So Frank was the one who had to organize and transport that whole thing. So over the next few years, I worked with Frank. I worked with a woman in Israel who was a survivor's daughter who was on the train. And we were able to track down over 275 people. And we got to reunite them with their American soldier liberators. You know, telephone, email, and several times in person. We had 3 reunions at the high school. We had 11 overall on 3 continents. I wrote the book, and I have a friend here today. His name is Mike Edwards, and he's actually filming. He's interviewing. We just interviewed Frank Towers Jr. for the film because we want to get the testimony of the liberators, the survivors, and also the second generation. And people who know something about this time period in history, because we can't let it be forgotten. Mike's been filming for over 7 years. And I don't have to tell you, most of our survivors and liberators are gone. So the book took me 10 years to write. Okay, so here I am, a high school history teacher, and I actually published it before I retired. And I have all these questions swimming in my head. I have all this material. And how am I going to put this story together? It has to be told. So as Tally states, whenever you're trying to educate about the Holocaust, first of all, you need to be as well educated as you can be. And this tour opened our eyes. I got to study at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because, again, they learned of my project and they wanted me to become one of their museum teacher fellows. I studied at Yad Vashem for 3 weeks, and that was intense, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority. So you have these questions, right? Well, what does 6 million deaths, Jewish population, look like? Can you imagine that number? And these are questions to ask your students, right? How many camps were there? I showed you the graphic. I had my kids count those little red dots. There's over 300. So who was responsible for the biggest crime in the history of the world? Well, your standard response is Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. Well, that's not the end of the story, is it? How many people did Hitler kill with his own hands? Think about it. He had an awful lot of help. Well, what does that mean? And what does it look like? How are the people on the train a snapshot of the Holocaust? European Jews murdered or who survived. So there's a lot of information because I had Polish Jews. That's where the Holocaust started in Poland, right? Outside of Hitler coming to power in 1933 in Germany. I had German Jews, I had Hungarian Jews, I had Dutch Jews, I had the whole micro. I even had Greek Jews on this train. Think about it. Why? Or can I make people care? I think I can, because I'm telling a story, and the story is not over. Why is it important to listen to people? You know, when we had the chance, if we were smart, we sat down. If we could, sometimes they didn't want to talk or they weren't ready, right? What happens when the stories aren't here anymore? I think we see the result every single day, don't we? And once people have absorbed these stories, do they have a moral responsibility to act on the lessons? Tomorrow, I'm speaking to school kids. You know, I talked to school kids for 30 years in the classroom, and these were the most important lessons I ever had the opportunity to teach. Sometimes they don't have answers, but that's okay because they make people think about choices, responsibilities, individual choice. Finally, is there such a thing as being a witness when you yourself were not there? I think there is, and that's the whole point of my book and the film that Michael is going to be working on. Okay, now this newspaper article is in the New York Times. I took a screenshot of it because it blew my mind. I put it on my blog. I'm sure Tally knows all about it because this was just before we left on our trip, right? The researcher there actually was a newspaper guy who was, you know, he had a fellowship to actually study this. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum commissioned a multi-decade study of the camps in Europe. Okay, remember I told you about the 300 dots? It looks very horribly impressive when you open up that 2-page spread in the book. But when you realize that by their count, and this count is now 10 years old, 42,500 Nazi ghettos and camps. Well, how did they come to the results? Well, you can go online, you can find the article, but think about that number, right? It blew historians' minds, but it was all there. It was all there as more records came to light. So the next question is, well, how can you say, let's say if you lived in a collaborator or perpetrator country during World War II, how can you say, which they all did, when the American GIs rolled into these German towns, oh, we didn't know. We don't buy that anymore, okay? So now we come to the story of one of the most notorious camps called Bergen-Belsen in Northwest Germany. And outside of a euthanasia center at Hadamar, and of course, going by the place where Ian Frank was born in Frankfurt in 2013, that's where we landed. We took a bus, stopped at Hadamar, but we went straight to Bergen-Belsen. And I'll never forget it because the day we got there, it was July 6th, 2013. And that was the day they were lowering my friend, Red Walsh, into the ground. I couldn't go to his funeral, but many Holocaust survivors made the pilgrimage to where they laid him to rest in upstate New York. I was in Bergen-Belsen for the first time in my life with my Holocaust teacher friends. And to give you an idea of what the story is, if you're not as familiar, by April 1945, this is what Nazi Germany in red looks like. You see that the Soviets in the East have already overrun Poland, etc. They're into eastern part of Germany. You can see that the Western Allies are now pushing, and they're just about to stumble upon this horrible, horrible place called Bergen-Belsen. Photograph of, it was liberated by the British 11th Armored Division on April 15th, 1945. Now our train was liberated on the 13th. I'll tell you how that happened, but this sign appeared a month later. It said 10,000 unburied people were here when the British came through. You had a camp that was designed for a few thousand people. On the day that the British 11th Armored came through the gates, there were 60,000 people in this camp. And again, it's the story of the end of World War II. The Germans were literally had nowhere to push a lot of these camps. Before they were overrun, they evacuated them. They shipped a lot of them to Northwest Germany here at Bergen-Belsen. Every day trains arrived. And on the day the British Army came through, they found 10,000 dead people. 800 people died on the day they were liberated in Bergen-Belsen, and they continued to die. Okay, so imagine the horror that these British soldiers came across. And we took this photograph. The first memorial was from the mid-60s, 20 years after the war, set there by the Jewish community. And Bergen-Belsen actually became a displaced persons camp after the war. Some of our survivors who were on this train, some of the survivors who were trapped in the camp for years, stayed in the camp for another, some cases, 5 years. Okay? They formed their own community and they managed to survive as they tried to plot together how they were going to rebuild their lives and where, more importantly, where. They couldn't go back home. And they couldn't get into British Palestine. So on our tour, we saw the layout of this huge complex, and this camp has every camp has a very, very different history. But Bergen-Belsen wasn't a quote unquote killing center, but it became one because they couldn't feed these people. Typhus broke out. And we walked, and it was a profound experience because it was like a walk in the park, so to speak, almost. And I can remember some of the teachers crying afterwards when we debriefed on it because it was a beautiful place. But it was a cemetery. It was a mass cemetery. Okay, so some of the pictures I'm going to go through fast is going to show you the 1945 photographs. Okay, here's the women's camp. Here's a photograph taken probably a few weeks after liberation. We know who that Dutch boy is, by the way. But contrast it with, this is the same place when our teachers were walking here. I'm seem to be walking through the woods. I'm actually, there was a latrine back there. Photograph of the gutter. And here's a 1945 picture of a man who's passed, he's dead. Okay, you know these two girls, I'm sure, from your history. Margot, her older sister, of course, that's Ian Frank. And this is not their final resting place, because nobody knows where their final resting place is. You know the Ian Frank story. A lot of people think she died in Auschwitz. Yes, she was transported there with her sister and her mother. But in November 44, they were transported to Bergen-Belsen, where the two girls died of typhus, probably in February or early March. Where are they buried? Probably one of these places. This says, here lies 800 dead. Of course, that's the picture you may have seen before. If you see a picture of a bulldozer pushing corpses into an open pit, it's probably Bergen-Belsen. And there's mass graves everywhere here today. Typhus was the big killer, born by the louse. And this is another one of Irvin Abadi's drawings. Typhus victim. Well, the reason you don't see anything here today is because there's nothing to look at. The British Army burnt the camp on May 15th to the ground to prevent the spread of disease. In 2007, they opened a new museum memorial. And I got to meet Bernd Horstmann, who I mentioned before, the German historian who with other historians found my photographs online and created an exhibit. You see the photographs in the background? And he told me more of the rest of the story. The story was this train on the first week of April 1945, 3 transports were ready to go to a place called Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, which is circled in blue. Basically, to get these people out of the way, the German high command, it was actually an order from Himmler, said, I want 3 transports of about 2,500 people each, because that's how many people had certificates or foreign papers that indicated they might be of some kind of use or value to a foreign government. In other words, they were going to be used as bargaining chips at the end of the war. Himmler's looking to save his own skin at this point. And now he's got something to bargain with, so to speak. So these 3 trains left the first week of April. And here are the 3 different color-coded routes. The Lucky train, I'll call it Lucky. Many people died on this transport, but this is the one in my book. Was liberated by the Americans on the 13th at a place called Farsley near Magdeburg. The second train actually made it to Theresienstadt on the 20th. The third train was liberated by the Russians 2 weeks after the first one. And it was very bad. So here are the 3 trains, and the story that I'm going to have you listen to for a few minutes here is the narrative of how Judge Walsh, then Red Walsh, came to liberate the train as an American soldier, but also how he got to meet a Holocaust survivor named Steve Barry, who only lived a couple hours away from him. He was from Boca Raton. And Steve was 21 years old. He was one of the older people on the train that we had the honor of meeting, who got to meet his American soldier liberated. So what's cool about this is it's actually an interview from 2010 where both men got to talk about the experience, and you can hear it in their own words. They're both gone now. And I think you're gonna like it. So I'm gonna let them talk for a minute.
Steve Barry went back into the passenger car on the train to sleep that night. The next morning, he saw that Nazi soldiers had come back.
Mounted SS troops came around, rode by the train, and started to yell, rouse, rouse, get out of the train, get out of the cars. And we saw them putting up machine gun nests. So obviously, even at that last moment, they were still trying to murder us.
And where were you at the time? Were you still in the passenger car at this point?
I was still in the passenger car, and no way would I have gotten out of there. In other words, if they wanted to kill me, they had to come into the car and shoot me.
But there were windows there. I mean, they could see you in there, right?
They could see me in there, of course. But see, it's a huge, I don't know how many railroad cars was needed to contain 2,500 people, but, you know, it's a long line of railroad cars. It was, I mean, the only thing they could have done at that point is probably just keep shooting, but it just didn't make much sense even to them. So when they saw that nobody was getting out of the car, they just packed up and rode away. Very short while later, they came back again in the opposite direction. My friends and I says, uh-oh, we know what's going on. We are surrounded. These guys can't get out because they went from left to right and they just disappeared. So we were absolutely right, because very shortly after that, we saw the first American GIs. And
were they in trucks or tanks? What did you see?
Well, actually, there were two tanks. I still get tears in my eyes. That's what it was. Right now, I have tears in my eyes, and I always will when I think about it.
That was the moment that you knew you were safe?
That we knew that we were safe. And we were sitting, we found some matches in those German soldiers' cars. So we had this tiny little fire going, and we were sitting next to it, and I was sitting there with this great big SS overcoat on, and one GI walked down the embankment, came over to the fire, sat next to me, took out his penknife, and he cut off the SS insignia from my coat and slowly dumped it into the fire. And if my voice breaks up right now, it always does when I say that, because it's a moment that is just never be forgotten. I don't know who the GI was, but it was something that, it just signaled something to me that maybe I'm safe. And maybe the war ended and the Germans or the Nazis are defeated.
What a symbol.
It was an unbelievable symbol to me, and all I can tell you is it still touches me very deeply, and probably always will.
A 24-year-old American soldier, Sergeant Carol Walsh, was commanding one of those tanks. He remembers the day they came upon that train near Magdeburg, as much as he remembers anything from those endless days of fighting.
Tired, I never thought about being tired. I can't explain that. You just didn't, you just kept going. I can't explain that to you. You just kept going. You didn't feel anything much.
Do you remember seeing the train the first time?
Oh, sure. I remember coming upon the train.
Did you know at the time that these were prisoners or had been prisoners, or that they'd been held by? Did you have any idea what they were doing there at the time?
No, I had no idea. I had no idea who they were, where they had come from, where they were going. Nothing. No idea. All I knew, here's a train with these boxcars and people jammed in those boxcars. No idea.
Steve Barry knew, as one of the young Hungarian Jews who'd been trapped on that train, that their luck had finally changed.
The Americans were totally unbelievable, because there is no other army in this world that would stop and help 2,500 lice-ridden, emaciated Jews to save them. What army would stop except the American army? I mean, this is a shooting war. I mean, these guys could have gotten shot 10 minutes later. The 30th Division stopped.
Did they have any food for you?
whatever they had on them, and it was mostly a chocolate bar or a cracker or whatever the K ration contained, or chewing gum. They immediately gave it to us, and then later on, they arranged for food and transportation to get us out of it.
I'm Dick Gordon. You're listening to The Story. Carol Walsh was one tired soldier when the Americans discovered the train of camp survivors, and they were still under orders to rout the remains of the Nazi soldiers, so they had a problem.
What are we going to do with these people? How can we handle this situation? Fortunately, there was another attached unit with the 30th Division. They were in the area. That battalion immediately went around the neighborhood there, getting food from the local farmers and bringing it to the people. And then overnight or the next day, there were other units that arrived to assist these people and find shelter for them.
It may be a silly question to ask, from this one moment, whether or not it stuck in your mind, but in the years after the war, did you ever think of that day when you came upon that train?
Not very much, no.
Yeah.
No, it was because it was just another day, you might say.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put that down or minimize
I
what was
understand
going on with these
it.
people, but it was just another incident, another day, and on you went. No, I didn't think about it much through the years, and I didn't really think much about it until I had this interview with Matt Rozell, the history teacher in Hudson Falls, New York High School. My daughter said, "Why don't you tell him about that train?" I hadn't thought even to mention the train to Matt Rozell, and I did. And as a result of that, that's how a lot of the programs and the connections with the survivors has come about.
Carol Walsh talks about the high school history teacher, Matt Rozell. In teaching about the Second World War, Matt invited veterans in to speak to his students. Well, that led to a website and eventually to an event, a reunion, that included both veterans and survivors. Carol Walsh was there.
It was quite emotional. You know what I said to them?
What's that?
Long time no see.
Only 62 years or something.
Yeah, that's all. It was quite emotional.
Yeah,
now
they were
the ones that I have met were very young on the train. A couple of them were, I think, teenagers, but for the most part, they were children.
But you say it was emotional. I mean, I can understand why it was emotional for them. You guys, whether you knew it or not, were the saviors and the heroes. But
well, let me stop there. No, not heroes. It all came about. It just so happened that Gross and I were the ones that our tanks were assigned to this particular scouting trip. Yes, those people look upon us as saviors. I don't know why. I don't feel like that. If you can understand my feeling, I don't. Yes, it came about because we got there. Yes, at that particular time, those SS guards took off, and it was the end of their ordeal. There's no question about that.
I mean, if you weren't the sole hero who saved them, and nobody's suggesting that's the case, you and the other tank commander, you were the symbols of their liberation.
Exactly. That's a good expression. That's a good description. Symbols. Yes, indeed. Yes.
And so if it was in a way just another day in battle for you, when you say that your reunions have been emotional, why are they emotional for you?
It's emotional for me when I think of where they were headed. They were headed to another concentration camp and extermination, and I get emotional now because I know what they went through, and what it meant to them that we happened to intercept that train at that time. They're real people. When I look back, they were almost not like real people when I first encountered them on the train, on the cars. They were just a large group, 2,500 figures.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden they have names, they had lives, they had families, they have stories. I guess that's why I find it emotional.
The Associated Press published an article about the reunion of survivors and liberators of that train beside Magdeburg. And that was the article that Steve Barry read. He'd been there. He'd been waiting a very long time to thank someone. And so he called up the high school history teacher and found out that Carol Walsh lived just a few hours away from him in Florida.
And I was just so anxious to hug somebody that was liberating that train that I just couldn't wait to meet with Carol. I called Carol and I explained to him who I was. And I said, I just have to come to you and I have to hug you. And he said, anytime, just please do come.
Steve Barry will never forget that meeting. He brought with him 2 daughters and a son-in-law.
We called on a cell phone. We called his home on a cell phone, said that we are almost around the corner from you. So when we drove up, the 5 of us drove up to the door, Carol was already outside.
Was it an emotional moment for you?
Unbelievable. It still is. It just never went away. And I walked over to him and we just embraced each other right in front of his house. I have all the pictures of that moment. And then we went inside and we met his wife, Dorothy. She's a very lovely person. But for some strange coincidence, or maybe it wasn't, we connected immediately. It's like we became true friends in a matter of a half hour and stayed that way. I call him on the phone. I exchange emails with him.
It's such an amazing thing that our lives were joined at that moment on April 13, 1945. All the years have gone by since. We've had lives, families, jobs, whatever. Here we are, and now we meet face to face and recall together that moment when my tank reached the train.
I kept calling him my liberator. He says, I'm really not your liberator. It was my job. I just happened to be there. I said, I don't care what you tell me, you're my liberator.
I actually have here in my studio, Steve, a copy of a letter that he wrote to you. And if you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of sentences. This is Carol writing to you, and he says, you're always expressing gratitude to me, to the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 30th Infantry Division, but I don't believe that gratitude is deserved because we were doing what we and the whole world should have been doing, rescuing and protecting innocent people from being killed, murdered by vicious criminals. You don't owe us, we owe you. We can never repay you and the Jewish people of Europe for what was stolen from you, your homes, your possessions, your businesses, your money, your art, your family life, your families, your childhood, your dreams, and all your lives.
Is this a beautiful person? When I got the letter, I said, I just can't possibly keep this letter to myself. I asked him if I have his permission to give this letter to some other people to read it, and he said it's okay.
That's right. I think I can't believe today, as I look back on those years and what was happening, I can't believe that the world almost ignored those people in what was happening. I can't believe it. How could we have all stood by and have let that happen? We owe those people a great deal. We owe those people everything. They don't owe us anything. We owe them for what we allowed to happen to them. That's how I feel.
Here's the actual letter that he wrote, and they exchange cards and letters all the time. And when Steve showed it to me, and I heard Carol talking about it, I had an opportunity that summer to present to the development people at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They saw this presentation, and the director, Sarah Bloomfield, was in the room, and she raised her hand and she said, "I want that letter." So it's in the custody of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum today, as it should be, because everything he said is what this project's all about. And I couldn't think of two better people to bring those ideas forward. So thank you for your patience listening to it. I'm going to end with a couple more things. Here's Frank, who was a major mover and shaker, and of course, Frank Jr., who's in the front row now, with our friend Ariella. Ariella's like my mom. They were born the same year. My mom's no longer with us, but Ariella is. And Michael and I, the film director, had a chance to go up and visit with her in Toronto in June. The kids, I mean, these soldiers, that's Frank there, they treated them like rock stars. And all this testimony was recorded in front of these kids. So you want to talk about a learning experience. Leslie Mizell's also a survivor from Toronto. Francis Curry, who was a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions as a 19-year-old in the Battle of the Bulge. Sarah Otzman came all the way from Israel to this Hudson Falls reunion. And they're signing autographs, and they're actually got to dance with the soldiers. This is combat medic Buster Simmons. Great, great time. Frank Jr. and Frank Sr. and I and my son had a chance to meet with 55 survivors in Israel in 2010. And 500 other people in the room, their descendants who probably wouldn't have been alive had it not been for Frank and the other soldiers. There's Leslie holding his quote unquote revenge, his granddaughter, in his study in Toronto. And that's Leslie as a 17-year-old who had some choices to make. And he talks about it in my book. Another girl that I met was 4 years old in Bergen-Belsen. Her name was Lily Cohen, very beautiful lady, very young Polish girl, struck up a very important bond. She came to the United States of America for a couple of reasons, but she wanted to meet me. And I got to visit her in Israel too. Okay, so I'm going to close with this. So the whole thing, like I told you, this whole story started in 2001. So in 2011, when we did the final reunion at the high school out of 3, I hadn't heard from any new liberating soldiers. Of course, they would have been older in many cases than the survivors who were children on the train. So I got to thinking, well, they must all be gone now, because by this time, most of them were. And the phone rang in my classroom. My school district put a telephone line direct into my classroom because the secretaries are fielding calls from all over the world. It was pretty cool. And it was this guy. And the first thing he said to me was, "Matt Rozell, God bless you. I've been trying to get a hold of you for a while." He must have read about me in the newspaper. But as it turns out, Walter was a medic. He was a combat medic. So after the soldiers were gone, fighting for that final battle victory at Magdeburg on the 18th, Walter stayed with these people for 6 weeks. And he nursed them back to health with other combat medics, American soldiers. And he said, "Matt, in all the reunions after the war, we never talked about Hillersleben because it was traumatic. We talked about a 15-year-old girl who he became very attached to, trying to nurse her back to health. She died in his arms, and he carried her out to the morgue tent himself. And she was buried in a mass grave. And the beautiful part of it, I don't know if it's beautiful, but Mike and I went back this spring and we found the girl's resting place. Walter, unfortunately, has passed away. But the last clip I want to show you is Mike and I had the good fortune of reuniting Walter were the person that he was probably responsible for saving. I don't know if you recognize this guy. He passed away this past fall, but he was Judah Salmon. He was a guest of the president for a State of the Union address because he was a survivor of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. And that's how we heard of him. Mike and I both read separately the Washington Post article where he talks about being on a train liberated by American soldiers. And the sensational headline was Holocaust survivor cheats death twice or something stupid like that. But it was actually a good, well-written article. And we got a hold of his daughter after a lot of sleuthing, and we got to reunite Judah from Pittsburgh with Walter, who lived in Scranton. And here's the last couple of minutes, and then we'll tell you the moral of the story, although I don't have to tell you what the moral of the story is. But this is when the two men got to meet each other.
It's a long time ago, over 70 years. It's a lifetime. And sadly, with time, your memories become dimmed, You just can't. But there are certain events that'll stay with a person all their lifetime.
I remember that the train stopped in the middle of a forest, and everybody panicked. Everybody felt that this is the place where they're going to come and kill us all. And sure enough, we heard a rumble of a tank, and then the turret opened, and a soldier popped out, and my father yelled, "Americans."
The response to seeing that star on the green painted tank and Jeep is one of unbridled joy for those survivors who were not too young to understand what it meant. It meant liberation. It meant that they were now saved. I'm gonna have you go ahead of me a little bit. Walter's at the table. Just go sit down
Right
next
here?
to him. Yep. There he is.
There is my friend, maybe my savior. So good to see you.
I never dreamt that this would happen someday.
Well,
Yeah,
it happened thanks to
but life is.
thanks to a couple of great gentlemen.
Yeah.
Hey guys.
Here's our
Hi.
good friend.
How are
Here's
you?
our good
Yeah,
friend.
he's the one
Group hug, group hug.
he's the one who united us.
Yeah, I know.
The three.
So we got our group hug in. A week later, Walter met another survivor because I did a talk in New Jersey, not far away from his home, about an hour away. And he died the following November at age 95. His family put the book in the coffin with him. He's chapter 14, The Combat Medic. And he said, "Matt, I've read your book over and over again." And he said, "I'm not reading it because I'm in it." But he was reading it because he wanted to understand the big picture. And that's what I wrote the book for. I wrote it for the survivors. I wrote it for the liberators. I wrote it for their families. I wrote it for the world. And now Michael is engaged in helping me tell the story on film. We hope it's going to be out in 2024. It depends on funding. Funding's always a thing. We do have a nonprofit. If you go to Teaching History Matters / the film, you can learn all about it. Maybe you want to help us, I don't know. But it's not something that we're doing to promote me. We're doing it because this is a story that is way bigger than me. It's way bigger than me and my wife. She's lived it with me. It's bigger than our trip, but they're all parts of this story that we cannot afford to forget. Finishing out, and again, maybe it's full circle. We don't even know yet because it doesn't seem like the circle's even closed yet. But we heard from this girl in Germany, and you can see a monument next to her. She and her high school classmates, along with some other people who were German or not German, helped fund a monument at the Liberation site. And Michael and I had the chance to go and visit with Johanna, speaks beautiful English. In fact, she helped translate. We interviewed German eyewitnesses. We interviewed German school kids about what it meant to them. Their teacher, their history teacher, they knew nothing about this history. Well, part of it was because this was communist East Germany 6 weeks after liberation. So the lessons, quote unquote. Here's the thing you want to remember, especially because we're here to talk and celebrate and commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. For every person liberated, 2,500 on this train, and not all of them survived after liberation, but they got to see they're liberated before they closed their eyes. Another 2,500 people perished in the Holocaust, if you're going to use that 6 million number. Okay, so it's not happily ever after. Just what did the survivors and soldiers go through, and what do they teach us about humanity? I think Red Walsh's words said it all. I think Frank Towers Sr. has some very profound things to say as he toured Europe, went to European synagogues, told his part of the story. And what about the perpetrators and the bystanders? Who are they? And what do their actions have to teach us? So these are things I'm going to bring up tomorrow in my talk with the school kids, but they're lessons for everybody. Okay, to bring it back to Auschwitz, I took this photograph when we were there. The focus needs to be on the people who suffered, okay? The survivors and the people who perished, the liberators and their fellow American soldiers and British soldiers and French soldiers who died. And this panel from Auschwitz, it happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. Primo Levi. This was in the Book of Names, or the room where the Book of Names was, by the way. Another guy we interviewed, and this is wrapping up my story. He was at Hillersleben as well, Luca Ferrari. People say it cannot happen here in this country. Yes, it can happen here. I was 21 years old. I was there to see it happen. He took this photograph of this girl. He tried to bring her home. The mother actually in Hillersleben camps gave him permission to try and get her to the United States. He stuffed her in his duffel bag, but her head stuck out. Her name was Irene, and he's still looking for her. I mean, look at her, right? May we be worthy of living in a time when people will no longer say that the other, by virtue of his beliefs or practices, real or imagined, has forfeited his right to exist. The author of this book was a child on the train that was liberated 2 weeks after. He was on the third transport, Joseph Polak, Rapid in Boston. Okay, so that's it for me right now. I do have books in the back if you're interested. They're $20 each, but I'm not here to sell books. You might be interested in learning more about the story though. And now I've gone over by how many minutes? 10. Sorry.
A huge thank you to Matthew Rozell for the work he's doing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Matt will be selling his book, and we have cookies in the back, and we're going to end. I'm going to invite Rabbi Kay. We're going to end with some uplifting music, because we always feel that our goal here is to educate. We want to have you join us for the journey, but we also want you to leave feeling like we can be the change that the world needs to see right now. So thank you for coming out. Matthew will be available to answer questions and to sign his book. And I can't tell you, if you haven't read the book, it's remarkable. So thank you all for being here, and we're gonna finish with some music. Thank you.
Dance me to your beauty with a burning violin. Dance me through the panic till I'm gathered safely in. Lift me like an olive branch and be my homeward dove. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the end of love. Let me see your beauty when the witnesses are gone. Let me feel you moving like they do in Babylon. Show me slowly what I only know the limits of. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the wedding now. Dance me on and on. Dance me very tenderly and dance me very long. We're both of us beneath our love. We're both of us above. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the children who are asking to be born. Dance me through the curtains that our kisses have outworn. Raise a tent of shelter now, though every thread is torn. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to your beauty with a burning violin. Dance me through the panic till I'm gathered safely in. Touch me with your naked hand. Touch me with your glove. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the end of love.